Hola, buenos días. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Soy muy feliz de presentar mis ideas sobre las disposiciones de abuso en el derecho internacional fiscal. I'm very sorry about my poor Spanish, so I will continue in English. I'm very, very grateful for the invitation. I'm grateful to Professor Vergara Quesada for inviting me to giving this speech. And I'm looking forward to presenting my ideas about the principal purpose test in Article 29.9 of the OECD Model Convention. Next slide, please. So when we talk about abuse and denying treaty benefits because of abusive behavior, one of the most important provisions is the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. Article 31, first paragraph, states that a treaty shall be interpreted in good faith in accordance with the ordinary meaning to be given to the terms of the treaty in their context, and for us, this is really important, in the light of its object and purpose. What is the purpose of a tax treaty? So first of all, we can find the purpose in the preamble. And if we read the preamble of the OECD Model Convention or the preamble of specific tax treaties, the wording is as follows. It says, intending to conclude a convention for the elimination of double taxation. So the main purpose of tax treaties are the avoidance of double taxation. And now it goes on, without creating opportunities for non-taxation or reduced taxation through tax evasion or avoidance. So a tax treaty shall also not be abused to reduce the tax liability. These are the two main purposes of a treaty that we can derive from the preamble. Of course, we can also get some additional purposes if we read the specific provision of the tax treaty. But for now, let's keep in mind that the two main purposes are avoidance of double taxation and then the fight against tax evasion and tax abuse. And this is further specified in the guiding principle. Gonzalo, please, the next slide. So the guiding principle can be found in the commentary of the OECD Model Convention in Article 1, and it states, it is a guiding principle that the benefits of double taxation convention should not be available where a main purpose for entering into certain transactions or arrangements was to secure a more favorable tax position, and obtaining the more favorable treatment in these circumstances would be contrary and now to the object and purpose of the relevant provision. So we have to analyze the specific provision, whether in these particular circumstances a treaty benefit should be granted or not. And because this guiding principle is only contained in the commentary, many countries are saying we interpret our treaties only in light of older commentaries, but not in light of the latest changes. Therefore, this guiding principle is not respected by all member states, by all contracting states of a specific tax treaty. And the OECD believed that it's necessary to elevate this provision to the black letter law, to a provision in the treaty, so that it becomes binding for everybody who applies the treaty. And this guiding principle is now found in Article 29.9 of the OECD Model Convention. And the guiding principle has been introduced into many tax treaties via the multilateral instrument. So Article 7 of the multilateral instrument has the same wording as Article 29.9, and it just states more or less the same as the guiding principle. The only difference is now it is part of the treaty itself and therefore binding for everybody who applies the treaty. Let's read Article 29.9. Gonzalo, the next slide, please. So Article 29.9 states the following. Notwithstanding the other provisions of this convention, so there may be additional anti-abuse provisions in the tax treaty, notwithstanding the other provisions of this convention. And now, a benefit under this convention shall not be granted. So the consequence of this provision is the denial of treaty benefits, if the following conditions are fulfilled. Let's go on reading. Shall not be granted in respect of an item of income or capital, if it is reasonable to conclude, having regard to all relevant facts and circumstances, that obtaining that benefit was one of the principal purposes of any arrangement or transaction that resulted directly or indirectly in that benefit. So if the main reason for this arrangement, for setting up the company or for concluding this contract, was reducing the tax liability or obtaining other benefits, then the treaty benefit should be denied. Unless, and now we come to the exception, unless it is established that granting that benefit in these circumstances would be in accordance with the object and purpose of the relevant provisions of this convention. So here it comes again. We have to analyze each provision and try to find the object and purpose of this provision, and then find out if, according to the object and purpose of this provision, the benefit should be granted or not. It's more or less the same what Article 31 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties is already saying. So it says a treaty should be interpreted in light of the object and purpose. So that means a treaty benefit can only be granted if the treaty benefit is in accordance with the object and purpose of this convention or this particular provision. What is different between Article 31 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties and Article 29.9 of the OECD Model Convention is that according to Article 29.9, the object and purpose becomes only relevant if a person has or wants to obtain a particular benefit. And of course, only in these situations, it's important to find out whether the taxpayer should get the benefit or not. So then courts and the tax administration should pay particular emphasis on the object and purpose of the provision or of the treaty as a whole. So it's just a reminder for the tax administration and the courts to take the object and purpose of the provision into account. Now, let me show you a few examples where Article 29.9 might be of relevance. The next slide, please. So, what is going on in this situation? We have ACO, a resident of country A, who receives royalties from country C. And let's assume the tax treaty between A and C provides for a maximum withholding tax rate of 5%. That means the source state may tax the outgoing royalty at a maximum rate of 5%. So what happens if the taxpayer says 5% is too much for me, and I want to use a more beneficial tax treaty, namely the treaty between country B and country C? So that's the next instance. Gonzalo, could you click? So now TICO interposes a shell company in country A. This is BICO. And now the royalty will be received by BICO after the patent has been transferred to BICO. But let's assume there's no real activity going on at the level of BICO. So the royalty is received by a letterbox company, a shell company. That's a sham transaction. There's no real substance in BICO. Is it necessary to apply Article 29.9 in this situation? And my opinion is, no, we don't need Article 29.9. Why? Because the domestic anti-abuse rule will already deal with letterbox companies. Many countries have anti-abuse rules which are saying in the situation where we have a sham transaction, the real situation has to be taken into account. What would be the normal situation without interposing the shell company? In this situation, the royalty would be directly received by TICO. So the effect of the domestic anti-avoidance rule is to reattribute the royalty to the real recipient, to the real beneficial owner. That means we disregard the shell company, the transaction, and attribute the income directly to TICO. In this situation, we apply the treaty between country T and country C, and the treaty between R and C is just not applicable. Is this a violation of the treaty between C and R? And I would say no. Income attribution is a purely domestic issue. It's not regulated by the treaties. That means each country is free to attribute the income to the person it thinks it is appropriate. So here, due to the application of the domestic anti-abuse rule, we have a direct attribution of the royalty to TICO, and therefore we have to apply the treaty between T and C, which provides for a 5% maximum withholding tax. Now let's take a look at the interposition of a company which has a little bit more substance. So we are no longer dealing with a letterbox company. Gonzalo, please, the next slide. So here there is no sham transaction, and I copied this example from the OECD commentary. So we have ACO, who holds shares in a company which is located in country S. And there's no tax treaty between country S and country T. That means country S can levy its normal withholding tax on the dividends, which would be, in my example, 30%. And ACO wants to avoid the high withholding tax. And the idea behind the transaction is to transfer the shares to a bank or another financial institution in country R, and there is a tax treaty between country R and country S. And in this tax treaty, there is a reduction of the withholding tax for dividends. So Article 10 provides for a 0 rate on dividends. Thereby, the withholding tax would be reduced from 30% to 0%. And the question is, can in this situation the tax treaty apply? So probably if everything went on with some substance, so there was a real transfer of the patent, and this is a real financial institution, then from a civil law point, it is the financial institution which receives the dividend. So according to domestic law, which follows the civil law attribution, there would not be any reattribution of the profits. But this does not mean that you can get the treaty benefits. So if we apply Article 29.9, if we ask whether this transaction was only done in order to get the benefit, there's a clear yes. So the transfer of the shares happened only to get a reduction of the withholding tax. And now the next question is, what is the object and purpose of the treaty between R and S? Is the object and purpose to grant benefits in situations where you just transfer the shares for one only single reason, namely the reduction of the withholding tax? And here the answer is a clear no. The treaty benefits should not be granted if the only reason for the transaction is a reduction of the tax liability. So here, object and purpose, Article 31.1 and also Article 29.9 of the OECD Model Convention clearly would deny the benefit of the treaty between R and S. So now let's go to another example. Can we go to the next slide? To the next slide, please. Thank you. So here we have a company, Pico, which produces certain products in country P and wants to produce these assets in another country in order to make use of the market over there or to produce at cheaper working conditions, or the raw material to produce these assets are closer in the other country. So the idea is setting up a subsidiary in order to produce certain assets. And economically, there are three target regions. So country S would be an ideal location from an economic point of view, country S2 and country S3. So the managers of Pico are thinking about where to locate the subsidiary. And all economic circumstances are more or less the same. So at the end of the day, the question whether there's also a tax treaty becomes decisive. And the tax advisors are telling the managers that neither country S1 nor country S2 has a tax treaty with country P. So at the end of the day, because of the tax treaty, country S3 is chosen as the location for the subsidiary. However, this case is different. There are lots of economic reasons to set up the company in S3. There will be real production going on. But one of the main purposes was also to make use of the existing tax treaty. So here the question is, will Article 29.9 also deny the treaty benefits? And if we try to analyze what the object and purpose of the treaty is, so is this an abusive transaction? It's clearly not a sham transaction. Are there some other good reasons for setting up the subsidiary in S3? Yes, there are lots of good economic reasons. And one of my suggestions for the interpretation of Article 29.9 is taking a look at the LOB clauses contained in Article 29.2 to 29.7 of the OECD Model Convention. With regard to the nexus requirement, where a sufficient economic link to a country, the LOB clauses give us some answers whether a transaction is abusive or not. And my opinion is, if a transaction is not abusive for the purposes of the LOB clause, then it is not abusive for the application of the principal purpose test of Article 29.9. And if we take a look at the specific LOB clauses in Article 29.2 to 7, we will also find the business purpose test is there an active conduct of a business. And if this is the case, if we have an active conduct of a business, then you would get treaty benefits according to one of the LOB clauses. Therefore, this setting up of a subsidiary in country S3 cannot be regarded as abusive, which also becomes relevant for the interpretation of Article 29.9. So we have to find out, is this abusive or not? And my answer is, because there's an active conduct of a business going on in country S3, there are plenty of other reasons to establish the subsidiary in S3. Therefore, I would say this cannot be regarded as abusive, and I would allow the grant of treaty benefits. Now let's go back to the text of Article 29.9. Could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So if we read Article 29.9 closely, then we will see that if certain conditions are fulfilled, that means if the main reason for the transaction, for setting up something, was obtaining the benefit, then, and these are the legal consequences, the benefit under this convention shall not be granted. So the consequence is the denial of benefit. Although, if you just take the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties into account, and you would ask, what is the object and purpose of this provision? You would probably say, if a person normally without the transaction would also get a certain benefit, the benefit is not as good as in this particular situation through the particular treaty, but nevertheless, the less beneficial advantage should then be granted. However, 29.9 is strict. It says no benefit at all. This can be avoided if you add an additional clause. This clause can be found in the commentary and says, will you go to the next slide? 29.10. So this is not in the model, but it's only in the commentary to say, if you want to grant certain benefits, even in an abusive situation, not everything, but a little bit of the benefits, then this is possible. And it says, where a benefit under this convention is denied to a person under paragraph 9, then the tax administration, the competent authority of the contracting state, that would have granted this benefit shall nevertheless treat that person as being entitled to either this benefit or to different benefits. So it's possible to grant a little bit less than under this treaty. So if we go to the next slide, I want to show you in which situation you could grant not this benefit, but other benefits which are not that advantageous. So take a look at this situation. This is similar to one of the prior slides we have already dealt with. So let's assume that this situation we have substance, so the treaty will apply, but we have in the normal situation, a royalty would be paid from country C to country T. And according to the treaty between T and C, there would be a maximum withholding tax of 5%. However, the taxpayer wanted to get a more advantageous treatment and therefore transferred the intellectual property right to BICO. And there is a treaty between country R and country C, which provides for a zero withholding tax on the royalties. So let's assume that this transfer of the IP right is abusive. We would apply Article 29.9, and 29.9 would say no benefit at all. This would mean the 10% withholding tax on royalties, the domestic rate would apply. I would say this is disproportionate because without the transaction, the taxpayer would have obtained at least a reduction to 5%. So here, the discretionary relief provision should grant this other benefit of 5%. Because without interposing BCO, TCO, the parent, would have received a 5% reduction. Okay, so let's conclude. What have we learned in this lecture? First of all, that normal sham transactions without any substance can be dealt with domestic anti-abuse provisions. Domestic anti-abuse provisions will re-attribute the profit. The attribution of profits is not dealt with in tax treaties, so it's domestic law which decides who is the recipient of the income, and then the application of the treaty follows. Treaty benefits, if we have substance, treaty benefits can be denied by just interpreting the tax treaty in a purposive way. That's what Article 31, first paragraph of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties tells us. We have a codification of this teleological purposive interpretation in Article 29.9. And it just confirms the guiding principle of the commentary and the provision of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which says that a treaty has to be interpreted in a purposive way. However, I would say in certain situations, Article 29.9 comes to a disproportionate result because it leads to a complete denial of treaty benefits. Therefore, I would recommend to introduce the discretionary relief provision of Article 29.10, which grants some benefits also in an abusive situation if, without the abuse, the lesser benefits would have been granted. This is the right result according to Article 31.1 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. So thank you very much for listening to my lecture, and I hope that I could give you some ideas on how to interpret Article 29.9 of the OECD Model Convention. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.